introduction, sort of introduction to Jesus' world, the world that he lived in. A lot of times we think, and maybe you've heard that Jesus was born into a peasant family. He never walked more than this many miles from home, and all these kind of things. And that's not exactly true. Jesus was a part of the Roman Empire. He was a citizen of the Roman Empire, and that impacted his world, just as we are part of an empire even today. Jesus traveled within the Roman Empire. As an infant, he lived briefly in Egypt. We sometimes forget about that. As a young man, he lived in Galilee. He was a descendant of kings. Joseph was not his actual physical father, but he was a descendant of David. And Mary, his physical mother, was also a descendant of David. He was a descendant of kings, a very rich Jewish heritage, but a Roman citizen. He traveled to specifically Roman areas. One of those was Caesarea Philippi, just full of idols. We'll look at that scene later on. He went to Tyre and Sidon, which is up in modern-day Lebanon, had a conversation there with a Syrophoenician woman. He walked into Jerusalem as if he owned it, and walked into the temple and ran people out, made whips and drove out the animals, and said, "How dare you make my Father's house a house of trade?" So he was in the empire. He was all over the place, not as far as Greece or Turkey or Rome or any of those things, but throughout the area he traveled some. He was meek, but he wasn't servile. And he didn't come from a servile background, as I think we'll see. But let's start with, it's going to be sort of picture day. We've got a lot of pictures and maps and things to sort of orient us to his world. Let's go first of all to Joseph and Mary's world before Jesus was even in this world in the flesh. It's on, but it's not moving. There we go. I don't know how well you can read this, but this is the area known as Galilee. It was a culturally mixed area. There were Jewish villages, and there were cities that had a mixed Jewish-Greek population, and there were basically sort of Greek-speaking Hellenist centers as well. How many people lived there? Well, Josephus, writing about, I guess he was around 100 A.D., he estimated 3 million people in Galilee. And that number seems pretty high. It seems real high. And most modern historians wouldn't go with that number. But it was not just empty fields with an occasional village here or there. It was a busy place. Now, most of the villages were small, but there were a lot of them. So between this place and my house, there may be 8 villages. So you have a little 1,000 people here, 2,000 people here, 500 there. Just go down the road a little bit, here's another village. So it was that kind of a population. The area of Galilee had, first of all, of course, it was a part of Israel under King David and Solomon. When the nation of Israel divided, Galilee went with Israel. It was the northern kingdom. And as we know, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom. They displaced the Jewish population. They put them into other parts of the Assyrian world and brought pagans into that area. They mixed the populations up. Well, when they did that, you ended up with the Samaritans among other groups, but it was no longer really a Jewish place. Well, let's fast forward to Jesus' day. In Jesus' day, all of the ancient Jewish world, all the way from Turkey down to Egypt, had all been conquered by the Ptolemies. They were Greeks. Alexander the Great led the first conquering of that area. And as a result, that whole area was under Greek domination. They spoke Greek and had Greek culture, Greek temples, all kind of Greek things there. The Jews remained, and they fought for their identity, but the general culture was made Greek. A family known as the Hasmoneans rose up and rebelled against the Greeks who were ruling the area a century or so before Jesus. And they ran out the Greeks and established a Jewish kingdom. That was in Judea, but not in Galilee. But when they were fighting, Rome came in, and so they sided with the Romans. They defeated the Romans' enemies, the Parthians. Have you got all this straight? There'll be a test. Okay. And as a result, the Hasmoneans began to move back up into Galilee. And about 100 years before Jesus' birth, that's when a lot of Jews began moving back into Galilee, because the Parthians and the Greeks had been largely driven out, and so there was room for them. It was kind of a slow-motion land rush moving up there. It's quite likely that Joseph's family, Mary's family, moved in the area at that time. As an area, its inhabitants had a distinctive accent. Remember the slave girl saying to Peter, "I know where you're from. I hear you talk." So they talked differently. They were more Hellenized, more like the Greeks, more Greek influence in Galilee still than there was in Judea, which worked very, very hard to be purely Jewish. You'll see a number of cities here that you may recognize. I'll see if I can use the little button here. Here is Cana, which is where the wedding feast was that Jesus went to, where he turned water into wine. Here is Nazareth, the city where the town where Jesus grew up. 50 years ago, scholars thought its population measured maybe in the low hundreds. The latest thought is Nazareth probably had around 1,000. More archaeological digs may expand that population. We just don't know. This is a major city, Sepphoris. It had been it had been a Jewish city, and then the Greeks had it, and then then it was destroyed in the war, and then King Herod Antipas was rebuilding it while Jesus was a young man. Jesus was called the carpenter's son. That word carpenter in Greek is tekton. And a more accurate translation, some people say, is builder, because a tekton, if you look at other texts, they could work with stone, they could work with wood. They were builders, they were constructors. And a lot of people speculate that Jesus' family, his father, his brothers, like a total of 5 of them, all went up to Sepphoris. That's where the most work would have been. It was fairly close, about, I think it was, well, I got 2 numbers. One said 2.3 miles away, and one said 4 miles away. Maybe that depends on the roads or as the crow flies or something. But close enough to walk to each day and work and to walk back home. You see the town of Magdala here. That's where Mary Magdalene came from. Here's Capernaum, where Jesus spent a lot of time. These 2 cities, Chorazin and Bethsaida, Jesus pronounced a curse on them. He said, if the great deeds had been done anywhere else but you, people would have believed. So they were sort of faithless cities. Here you see the Decapolis. That simply means the 10 cities. It was a very Greek area. If you remember, Jesus crossed over the sea, went to the Decapolis, and that's where he cast the demons out of the man who was demon-possessed living among the tombs, and the demons went into pigs, and they ran down into the water. Greeks loved pork, and they had a real taste for pork, and they raised pigs. Jews considered pigs unclean, So the fact that he was over there and there were pigs lets you know that was a very Greek area there. We're going to return to Galilee, but let's quickly go to the place of Jesus' birth. A couple of things to look at here. I'm still not, there we go. Bethlehem. I'm learning this shareware program. I can't put the credits on the screen, so I'll just tell you the credits. This slide, the next two slides, are from an article by Matthew J. Gray entitled, "O Little Town of Bethlehem, Archaeological Insights into the Setting of Jesus' Birth." That was from 2022. Bethlehem means house of bread. And by Judean standards, it was pretty well watered. It was rocky terrain. It was a little bit bigger than Nazareth, about 2,000 people, they estimate, in Jesus' day. It was about 5 miles south of Jerusalem, and that affected its economy. It was a almost exclusively Jewish population, not totally, but almost exclusively Jewish population. It was rich in history. Rachel, Jacob, or Israel's wife, is buried very near to Bethlehem. Bethlehem was the birthplace of King David. That's where he was born. That's why Joseph and Mary went there during the census. By the way, the Romans loved to keep records. They insisted on a census. Caesar Augustus said, "I want a head count of everybody in my empire." The Jews stoutly resisted a census. If you remember the story about David decided to count the people of Israel, and it turned out disastrously. And God said, "Okay, I can either punish you or punish the whole city of Jerusalem, all the people of Israel." And he said, "Put the punishment on me." Punished for trying to take a census. So the Jews opposed a census. They finally submitted to a census by Augustus if they could go back to their hometown and have the census taken. That way you're not just counting individual heads. It's like you're counting families. And the original plan was for every family to hold their plot of land in perpetuity, and it would just pass from one person to the next. The year of Jubilee, if you sold it, it would go back to your family. So they were no longer practicing that, but still to go back to your hometown said, I belong to this family, this place, and that made things better somehow. Count me as part of the descendants of David in Bethlehem and not just as a head in your empire. Many people in Bethlehem raised sheep, and they raised them for sacrifice in the Jewish temple. They sacrificed 2 lambs a day, huge sacrifices at Passover. So that was one of their chief things to do, was to raise sheep. This is a picture from modern day side of Bethlehem. You can see how rocky it is. They have little walls built up and little caves in which they could go and take their animals. That's just sort of a brief picture of what that looks like. The limestone in that area, and it is a limestone, is pretty soft, easy to carve out, and also a lot of caves. Okay, if we can get this up. And this is a cave which dates back to the 1st century. It could have been there in Jesus' time, could have been a little bit after Jesus' time. Most of these started out as natural caves, and then they dug these out to use to keep animals in, to store grain in, and other things. This cave was used for animals. On my left, I guess your right, you see the little niches in the wall. There it is there. That's where you put your lamp, so you could sort of see what you could see in that dark hole. And then on the other side were troughs, and troughs at different levels. For shorter animals, bigger animals, different troughs, and that's where they would put the feed. So you keep livestock there. And we read there was no room in the inn, and so baby Jesus was wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid in a manger. This is quite likely the kind of thing we should imagine that being. It was underground. It was more temperate in temperature. It was probably kind of smelly, but laid in a manger there. Not exactly like the Christmas creches we see with lots of straw around and a little handmade manger to lie in. All of that is a very different kind of place. Excuse me. Luke is the only one who records, the laying out of Jesus in this trough, really a feeding trough. But I think the correspondences came to his mind. Think about the beginning of Jesus' life and the end of his life. When he was born, he was wrapped in swaddling clothes, wrapped around, and placed in a manger in a cave underground. When he died, he was wrapped, we're told. We see the Shroud of Turin, but we're also told that he was wrapped in clothes. So they put the herbs around him and wrapped those up. He was wrapped up in death and placed in a tomb carved out in a rock underground. I think that sort of correspondence, beginning and end, so similar, probably struck Luke and why he included that in his gospel. One more thing we ought to mention about Bethlehem, because it's really important for Jesus' life and ministry. This is a place called the Herodium. It was built by King Herod the Great. About 3 miles south of Bethlehem is this big artificial mountain. It's big. It's an artificial mountain just built by King Herod the Great. It's a place where he had palaces. There was a lower palace, which is not really evident here too much. And then on top was the upper palace. King Herod the Great ruled 4 areas, pretty much most of traditional Israel. But he was a so-called client king. That is, he was king, and they let him be the boss, as long as he did what the Romans said, did the census they commanded, whatever they wanted, he did. He paid the taxes to them, and we'll let you run it. But you're under our control and our power. He was a client king. Romans could install him or throw him out anytime they wanted to. Well, Herod, he was not a native Jew. His father was a convert from Idumea. He was Idumean. That's from ancient Edom. They were enemies of the Jews. But his father was a convert, probably by being conquered by the Hasmonean Jews, and it was just politically expedient or maybe just necessary to convert to Judaism. So his father did that, and he was Jewish, but it was more of a political identity and not really a deep faith matter for him. Just like many people today can be a cultural Christian. I'm a Christian because it's politically the smart thing to do or something, but not really invested. That's how he was with Judaism. He was a great builder. He built a lot of things. He constructed palaces, aqueducts to bring fresh water to cities. He built fortresses, all kinds of things. His greatest building project was the temple. And the temple, he doubled in size from 14 acres, more than doubled, from around 14 and a half acres to about 36 acres for the whole temple area. An immense thing with immense stones, impressive. He made it the biggest, the most impressive, covered in gold, most impressive by all accounts of any religious structure anywhere in the Roman Empire. And he did that. The Herodium was a fortress. He was pretty paranoid, probably a good right to be. A very elaborate palace there. The top palace had 7 towers, had a Roman bath, and with all the parts of a Roman bath. There was the caldarium, the hot water you got into. And then you went to the tepidarium and kind of got your body temperature regulated. Then you went to the frigidarium and a fresh, cool water to refresh you. He had all of those things in this there. A private theater that would seat 650 people, but a private theater box separated from them for him and his guests. By the way, the Emperor Augustus visited King Herod the Great twice. And that's pretty impressive. Herod was not a nobody. He was a somebody. He was under Roman authority, but to have the Roman emperor visit you twice says something. Herod was also a very canny ruler. The temple pleased the Jews, and the Jews were his people. So he just rebuilds that temple, makes it great. That pleases the Jews. Remember how proud the disciples were. They said, Lord, look at this temple. He said, don't get too excited. There won't be one stone left on another. But they were impressed. But it was also a monument to himself, right? Who built this? Herod. So that bolstered his reputation, and it pleased the Jews. He put a Roman standard with a Roman eagle on it outside the temple. So the Romans were reassured, this is not a rebellion here. This is not hyper-Judaism. We're still your subjects. He was that kind of a canny ruler, covering all of his bases, trying to please the people he needed to please to make things work. He was a very suspicious person. By the end of his life, he was an absolute paranoid. At the end of his life, by the end of his life, I should say, Herod had killed his second wife. He had 10 wives. He killed his second wife. He killed 2 of her sons. He killed a mother-in-law. He killed a brother-in-law. He killed another son. He killed 46 members of the Sanhedrin, that ruling council of Jewish leaders. And he killed all the remaining members of the Hasmonean family. He did not want any rivals to his power. That's why he ordered the slaughter of all the boys in Bethlehem who were 2 years old or younger, making sure that there was no rival to his throne. As you recall, the wise men came and said, a king is being born. The elder said, it's going to be king of the Jews. He said, we'll put an end to that. Herod wants to be king of the Jews. He wants no rivals. Powerful, but illegitimate king. Big, imposing physical presence. And here is Jesus, born, laid in a manger, a feeding trough, who is going to say, we don't need this temple anymore. I am the king. I will rule from heaven, not from Jerusalem. And we won't need a temple at all. That will dwell in individual hearts and in the fellowship of my disciples. But his family had to flee to Egypt. What did that mean? Well, here's a picture. You can see Judea in green up in one corner, and then the Roman Empire encompassed all of that area of Egypt. That little red line is around the green to let you know that it was a separate kingdom, but it was subject to Rome. Egypt was a long ways from Judea. One source said 350 miles, 315 miles. I think that's by air flight. By road, it's going to be 400 plus miles. That's a long way to walk. Mary and Joseph flee to Egypt. Probably would have taken about a month to get there. It was possible at this time, this was at the beginning of what was called the Pax Romana, 200 years of peace and safety and good policing in the Roman Empire. So it was safe enough for them to travel. Why did they go to Egypt? Well, to get away from Herod's jurisdiction, but and because the angel said go to Egypt. But why Egypt? Well, Egypt had a very old and large Jewish population at this time. After the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, many Jews fled to Egypt. 2 cities there had a very heavily Jewish population. The first one was Alexandria, and the other one was Leontopolis. Alexandria was founded by Alexander the Great in 332 BC. A lot of Jews lived there. About 1/3 of the population of that city was Jewish. So they're there among fellow believers. They had a degree of political autonomy, had their own rulers in their sector of the city. So that was a good place to go. But the Jews of Egypt were Hellenized. That means many of them spoke Greek, which was kind of the lingua franca of the Mediterranean world. If you had a second language, it wouldn't have been Latin, it would have been Greek, because the Latins spoke Greek, and the Hebrews spoke Greek. Egyptians spoke Greek. That was everybody's second language. But they were more Hellenized. They spoke Greek more readily. Some Greek habits and customs. One of the most notable things, well, two notable things about the Jews in Egypt. This is Alexandria up there. In Alexandria, the Old Testament was first translated into Greek. It was called the Septuagint. And that was a very influential translation. Many of the quotations in the New Testament are from the Septuagint, apparently, and not directly from the Hebrew. So it's a very influential translation. A second thing about the Jews in Egypt, Leontopolis was down around this area near the city of Hierapolis. They built a replica temple in Leontopolis. It was a replica of Solomon's temple. It had the right shape, the right everything there. They brought in Levites, they brought in priests, and they offered sacrifices in Egypt at this other temple. And that's pretty amazing. But they were trying to preserve, after the temple fell, they reestablished a temple down there. The Romans destroyed this temple at the same time they destroyed the Jerusalem temple. Jerusalem temple was destroyed in AD 70. This second temple was destroyed in AD 73. But the whole point is a very Jewish place, much more Jewish place there. How long did Jesus stay in Egypt? Scholars debate. On one hand, some would say they made a month-long trek to Egypt, stayed a few months, and then came back, based on the fact that Herod died not too long after they fled. Others think he may have spent as much as 4 or 5 years in Egypt before they came back. That's certainly possible too. We know he was back from Egypt by the age of 12 because he was in the temple at age 12. Matthew is the only gospel that says that Jesus went to Egypt. Other gospels don't mention it. Luke says that on the 8th day, Jesus' parents presented him in the temple and went back to Nazareth. But Matthew says they went to Egypt. So a way to reconcile those two is maybe after the 8th day they went back to Nazareth, and then King Herod, not satisfied with killing the infants in Bethlehem, looked up all the kids who were born in Bethlehem but went somewhere else and was trying to track them down and kill them. For that reason they went to Egypt. Something we'll have to ask about in eternity. We don't really know. Jesus, called Jesus of Nazareth. In small villages, you were known, your last name was sort of your village for many people. And if your last name wasn't your village, then your last name would be your father's name. Remember Peter as Simon Bar-Jonah, that is son of Jonah. So your, quote, last name, identifying name, would either be where you came from or who your father was. Well, Jesus known as Jesus of Nazareth. He was never known as Jesus Bar-Joseph, son of Joseph, because he wasn't his father. Nazareth, as I said, about 1,000 people is the best number they have here. It's not on a main road. But a lot of times God uses people in out-of-the-way places, right? So you don't have to be in a big, important place to be an important person. God sent Moses into the desert for 40 years. Jesus spent a large part of his life in Nazareth in times of preparation. It was known as a dead-end place. One of Jesus' disciples said, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" before he met Jesus. When Jesus went back, he spoke in the synagogue in Nazareth. And they said, "We hear you doing miracles. Do a miracle for us. We want to see a miracle. You know, you're our homeboy. Let's see you do something great." And he said, "You're not going to get a sign. You're not going to get a miracle." And they got furious and wanted to throw him over a cliff and kill him. Small town, small-minded people, small hearts, but that's where Jesus grew up. He was the carpenter's son. What is the status of Jesus' family? To me, this is kind of interesting. We know lived in Nazareth, know his father was a tecton. Jesus was never, they didn't say, "Isn't this Jesus the tecton?" They said, "Isn't this Jesus the tecton's son?" We don't know really exactly if Jesus always just worked with his father or not. But a couple of clues that Jesus wasn't just a dirt poor peasant, as we sometimes think. Let's consider these. Okay, let's go to Mark 2. We're running out of time. If that's too small to read, I'll read these to you. Verses 1 and 2. "And when Jesus returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. And many were gathered together, so that there was no more room, not even at the door." He was at home? Whose home? What home? Verse 15 continues this whole passage. "And as Jesus reclined at table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples." A lot of people here. And twice Mark refers to he was at home, he was in his house in Capernaum. Some say, well, that must have been the Apostle Peter's house. But it doesn't say he was at the Apostle Peter's house. Other places it does. It says he was at Peter's, healed Peter's mother-in-law who had a fever. This doesn't say he was at Peter's house. It said he was at his house. So it's possible the family had moved from Nazareth up to Capernaum, and it's possible they had two houses. We don't really know. It makes us think. Now, Jesus did say, "Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but I don't have anywhere to lay my head." That doesn't mean he was by birth homeless. I think he's saying, I gave up my home to walk and teach and preach and just couch surf, throughout Galilee and Judea. But he gave up his home. That's the message he gave to his apostles who also had houses. And he said, no one who gives up house or family or any of these things will give it up, but they will get back more in this life and heaven in the life to come. So I think he's saying, I gave up my home for the ministry. You give up your home. We will all be repaid. So it's easy to think of him as having a home or maybe two. Okay. Let's look at a couple of other things. Let's look at Jesus' languages. I don't know. We don't have time. Okay. We'll stop. Jesus spoke multiple languages. We can talk about that. Jesus was known as a rabbi, it seems, even before he was out preaching. And that's kind of an interesting thought. We'll talk about that a little bit next time as we get deeper into the Scriptures. Thank you.